Good afternoon. My name is Mitchell Fate, and I did my research paper on Bob Dylan and his 1960s protest song, Blowin' in the Wind. For those of you who don't know who Bob Dylan is, he was born as Robert Allen Zimmerman on May 24, 1941, in the small mining town of Hibbing, Minnesota. He grew up idolizing rock stars Little Richard and Hank Williams, as well as movie star and rebel James Dean. He attended the University of Minnesota, where he discovered a love for folk music and a new hero in Woody Guthrie. After just 2 years at Minnesota, he dropped out of college and left for New York in search of Guthrie. He rose to fame as a folk music singer, but soon traded in his acoustic guitar for an electric one and became a rock and roll artist, which angered many folk purists. No matter the genre, Bob is one of the most decorated songwriters of all time. He has been elected into both the Rock and Roll and Songwriters Hall of Fame, won a multitude of Grammys, was given a Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama, and this past year became the first songwriter to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Bob became famous in the 1960s, which was the era of the counterculture. The counterculture embraced peace, love, and drugs. They were for civil rights and against war, which led to many protests in the decade. These protests began in 1960 with sit-ins and continued in 1961 with interracial freedom rides. Later in the decade, we'd see the rise of the great speaker and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The anti-war movement reached its height around 1965 when the first combat troops were deployed to Vietnam. Bob claims to have written Blowin' in the Wind in just 10 minutes in April of 1962. The song appeared on his 1963 album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. It posed 9 rhetorical questions. The answer to all of them is blowin' in the wind. These questions alluded to the civil rights and peace movements at the time. Lyrics such as, "How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man?" reference the plight of African Americans to gain rights and respect in the United States. Lyrics like, "How many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned?" obviously reference the struggle between war and peace in the world. On his first night of performing the song, Bob claimed this was not a protest song. However, because the ideals he expressed in the song did not reflect what the majority of Americans felt at the time, I do believe it has an element of protest. The song was covered by more than 50 artists within the first year of its release. The most commercially successful version of the song was performed by the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. They also had some of the greatest live performances of the song. In 1963, they performed it at the March on Washington just hours before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. And in 1965, Peter of the group played it at the March on Selma. Aside from its great lyrics, some of the contributions to the song's success are the timing of its release, its simplicity, and its adaptability. It is simple in that it only takes 3 chords on the guitar to play, and its lyrics are easier to memorize than some of Bob's 7-minute ballads. This made it so that almost any hippie could pick up a guitar and sing it at a protest. It is adaptable because it does not pertain to any specific event going on at the time, like his earlier songs about Emmett Till and Medgar Evers did. In conclusion, Bob led the folk movement. He was the voice for people who did not have a voice. The 1960s were a revolutionary decade. Aside from the civil rights and war and peace movements that were going on at the time, there were movements for women's rights and gay rights. The lyrics in Blowin' in the Wind reflected the issues of the peace and civil rights movement in the 1960s, but still remain relevant today. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, the song is adaptable. The lyrics that were once interpreted as pertaining specifically to African Americans' struggle for rights could now be interpreted as pertaining to the struggle of Middle Easterners for rights in America. The lyrics that were once considered referencing the Vietnam War could actually reference any war in human history. Here's my bibliography. Thank you for listening.